So I'm just going to say it. The Israeli government is committing a modern Holocaust. Now, I love Israel and the Israeli people, and I know how horrible it is to use the H word for the actions of a government that many Israelis are actually against and have very little control over. But think about it this way. If a government was going to commit a modern Holocaust, it will look a lot like what Netanyahu and his government is doing. Indiscriminate killing, massive starvation, and trying to cover it all up. In this episode, I'll get into how and why. So this is Left and Loose. I'm your host, Rich Kim, and this is a weekly show where usually I pour a big glass and I call out Republican bullshit. This week, I'm going to talk about an issue that affects both sides of the aisle. Now, before I get into this episode, I just have to say up front, Hamas is an evil terrorist organization. What they did on October 7th, 2023 was an absolute atrocity, and Israel had every right to then go in and disable Hamas. Of course, the way that they went about it, there were issues with that, also with the U.S. support that was provided. But we'll get into that, and still, the fact remains, Israel had every right to defend itself. Now, in the 2 years since October 7th, we've seen this war morph into something else, something much darker. And I think it can be broken down to basically three phases. Phase one, there was the retaliation against Hamas. Phase two, creation of open-air camps and starvation as a weapon of war. And phase three is mass extinction and a cover-up. We're now in phase three, and that's where I believe the H word comes in. So I'll get into these three phases. As I'm doing that, though, focus on the how and the why of what the Israeli government is doing. Okay. Phase one, October 7th happens. And it's a horrible event. Israel pulls together its troops to then go into Gaza. Now, the entire world is rallying behind Netanyahu and his government. Remember, Netanyahu at the time was in not a great situation. There were these mass protests in Israel due to reforms that were passed in order to weaken the judicial system there, which sounds very familiar to us Americans. And Netanyahu, furthermore, was basically just staying in office in order to avoid prosecution for corruption, alleged crimes. Also sounds very familiar to us. Still, the government is taking this action to retaliate against Hamas, and there's this rally around the flag effect, both internationally and domestically within Israel. Now, remember how Gaza actually is at the beginning of this war. It's a tiny strip of land that's one of the most densely populated places on Earth. A little over 2 million people living in an area that's just 25 miles long and a few miles wide. Just think about how short, for example, a 25-mile drive is. So basically, in this tiny strip of land, there's just like city after city after city after city. And Hamas, being the evil fucks that they are, have embedded themselves among the sort of civilian population. So they built tunnels everywhere. They have all of these different facilities that are within like civilian infrastructure. They're using civilians as shields, basically. So what does Israel do? They flood the tunnels. They take out Hamas fighters. And they start dropping bombs. Now, on that last part, these bombs are like, for example, up to 10,000-pound bombs, also provided by the U.S. And when you think about dropping such a huge bomb in a densely populated area, of course, there's going to be a huge amount of casualties, civilian casualties that are happening. But back then, for example, when like a hospital was hit or an apartment building was hit, at least the Netanyahu and his government were trying to come up with like some justifiable excuse. Like, okay, there was some substantial Hamas operation that was being targeted, and also real intel in order to back that up. And this was just an unfortunate event that happens. Lots of questions that could be asked there, but that's the justifications they were at least trying to make at the time, for what that's worth. But then Netanyahu and his government is consistently saying at this point, we want the complete annihilation of Hamas. There, I think there's even bigger questions of like, what does that mean? And we've seen that then through the rest of this war, right? Where, okay, is it like trying rooting out every single Hamas fighter? You really got a question of like, okay, this just means a never-ending war, right? But then we get to phase two. So months and months are going along, and Hamas is being taken out along the way. That Israel is continuing to be successful in its war against Hamas. Also, civilian casualties are piling up. The IDF, which is Israel's military, is now saying to Gazans they want the Gazan population to move from different cities to other parts of Gaza. And their reasoning for this was they're saying, oh, we want the population to move so that we can fight Hamas. And, you know, the civilians are going to be away from that. Again, you got to wonder if this reasoning really makes sense at the end of the day. Because, well, it's not like Hamas is going to just stick around and then suddenly show themselves and fight out in the open. They're going to continue to be the evil fucks that they are, and they're going to keep moving within the civilian population in order to try to then, again, keep using civilians as shields. Still, okay, this is the military logic that's being put forward, and now Gazans are being forced to leave where they're at and to move then to all these different places. This results basically in the creation of open air camps. These are places where it's not meant to take on these many people at once. Like, there's not the facilities and infrastructure in order to do that, but it's people being forced into these concentrated areas. And then we know what happens next. It's a starvation. So the amount of food going into Gaza has varied at different times of the war. There's been hostage negotiations. There's been a temporary ceasefire. There's been international pressure to get food into Gaza. And there's been, for example, there's been attacks on aid trucks that have resulted in like food deliveries being stopped altogether. So the amount of food going in has varied, but so it's going like a little bit up or way down at different times, but there's one common thread, and that is this is a tiny amount of food for a very large population. So this is like food to feed maybe small villages or towns, and not, like I was saying, the cities of people that are in Gaza. And Netanyahu and his government has put forward this justification for that. They've said, hey, the reason that we're limiting food delivery to Gaza is because Hamas raids these deliveries, steals the food in order to feed their fighters, or then to resell it on the black market, because food is a commodity in Gaza, right? It's now a rare good. And then they profit from that, and that's how that they finance their side of the war. Okay, even if you think that's true, And the Israeli government has not put forward any actual evidence of that. But there is some logic, right? And even if that is true, there would be one humane solution to all of that. And that is to flood Gaza with food, to just open the floodgates and put as much food in there as possible, because that way food no longer becomes a commodity, right? Once it's everywhere, then it's not a big deal. If yes, there's some Hamas raid here or there, people are getting food and it's just not such a precious good. And the craziest part about all of this is there are warehouses full of food in neighboring countries just waiting to go into Gaza. There are trucks waiting to deliver all of these food, and the trucks just have to go over the border and they deliver these different parts, and they just have to, it's easy to do that. It'd be easy for that to make it happen. And keep in mind that the IDF is one of the most sophisticated militaries in the world, but then suddenly they can't figure out how to let food trucks go into these different parts of Gaza without being targeted. So of course, starvation and famine sets in, and people are already dying from starvation or from pre-existing conditions that have been connected with the starvation or been made worse by the starvation. Now, it's tough to say exactly when, let's say, this phase 2 would end, but for example, the military leader of Hamas, Yahya Sinwar, was taken out last year in October. And then basically during the early part of this year, Hamas has been entirely disabled. Like there's little pockets of resistance here and there, but during the course of this year, that the IDF has been successful in their military mission here, and that's what I would say is the end of this phase 2. Even so, Netanyahu and his government are still saying, okay, we're going to continue this war until all of Hamas is eliminated. Now we're getting into phase 3, and that is this mass extinction and this cover-up. So at this point, 2 years out, the military goals of Israel have been accomplished. Hamas is disabled. There is this horrible starvation that has set into Gaza. Israel could say at this point, okay, you know what? We've accomplished our goals. It's time to actually get into a ceasefire and free the hostages that are still there or their remains from October 7th. However, in each of the negotiations that have revolved around a temporary ceasefire, there's been multiple opportunities for that. The Israeli government has basically sabotaged these. They've consistently moved the goalposts knowing that Hamas would not agree to a temporary ceasefire. Instead, the Israeli government is continuing their bombings and their attacks in general. And now at this point, they're not even putting forward any justification when civilians are being killed, or barely any justification. So for example, when an apartment building falls, it's like, oh, okay, there was some Hamas operation that was just being targeted there. And yeah, that just happens. Or for example, when there was a group of women and children standing outside of a clinic called Project Hope back in July of this year, waiting for food supplements, there was an attack on that group, an Israeli strike on that group that resulted in women and 10 children being killed. And the Israeli statement on this was, we'll review the matter, and yeah, we think that there was a Hamas operative there. I'm sorry, even if you had some intel that there was a single Hamas operative there, that does not justify now the bodies of children, I'm sorry to be dark about this, that are resulting from your strike. This is, in fact, a war crime, and that's just one example of what the Israeli government is doing. And now, as if the bombings and the strikes on civilians are not bad enough, as if the starvation is not bad enough. The Israeli government is now doing something further. They've limited the amount of food going in, right, during phase 2. Now in this phase 3, they are creating just a few distribution points where that limited amount of food can be distributed. So Gazans at any given point have access to only let's say 1 or 2 food distribution centers. And these starved people now need to go sometimes miles in order to get to these particular places and then wait in order to receive any kind of food whatsoever. So of course, there is massive crowding at these places. There is a lot of disorderliness. And as a result, the IDF has routinely open fired on these civilian groups, right? Of course, things are going to get out of hand. But then the IDF response is to fire on crowds of hungry people. And one political commentator put this perfectly, I thought, and it was that the stated goal of this is to feed Gazans, when in fact it is to kill Gazans. That has been the result. Now is where we're getting to the sort of center of the matter in this phase 3, and where I think the H word comes in. It's that Netanyahu and his government are actually wanting or choosing to ignore the amount of casualties that are happening among Palestinians, civilians in Gaza. I think you could see just a clear example of this. Just a few weeks ago, Netanyahu stood in front of cameras and said there's no starvation in Gaza. Now, just common sense would contradict this, right? We know how long the war has been going on. It's been dragging on for years at this point. We know how little food has been coming in, and it just doesn't add up. Like, that math ain't mathin', that you're gonna stand there and say that there's no starvation going on in Gaza. And beyond that, it's like we also can see with our eyes the evidence that is coming out of Gaza to indicate that, in addition to all just the horrible atrocities that are going on there. And this evidence is, by the way, just also very limited because Netanyahu and his government are not allowing international journalists into Gaza in order to report on this. So to me, this is the heart of the cover-up, and very similar to what was happening in Germany in World War II, that there was a big cover-up of what was happening at the time. And if you were going to take like a modern parallel, it would look quite a lot like this, right? The UN, a UN commission, has declared that there's been a genocide in Gaza. So there's a genocide of a people. There are bombings, attacks, strikes, and starvation of people in camps and in ghettos. And then there's a big cover-up. I don't know how else to describe this other than the H word. Now, those are the 3 phases. In my mind, let's just take a big step back and look at the big picture. It might be the case that like tomorrow, miraculously, by some amazing feat of God, that there is a ceasefire in Gaza. Of course, Hamas would need to agree to that. And again, they are evil terrorist fucks, so who knows? But the ones in control here are Israel. Israel is now the complete power here. Again, Hamas has been militarily disabled in Gaza. So Israel is the one who decides when the actual military conflict ends or not. And unfortunately, it just doesn't look. And unfortunately, that's just looking really unlikely because the incentives here are for Israel to continue this war, for Netanyahu and his government to continue this war. This war is the only thing that is holding his ultra radical right wing government together. And it's the only thing that is keeping him in power. And it's the only thing that is keeping him for prosecution for his alleged crimes. So when you're going to be the sole power in this area and you're going to continue prosecuting this war sort of against what is essentially now a civilian population, I mean, where does that leave you at the end of the day? And I'll just have to add one last thing here in this, just one last question. Does anybody think that this is still good for Israel, what's happening here? That this is actually benefiting the Israeli people? All of Israel's allies internationally, other than the US, have turned against Israel at this point because they can see what's happening here. They acknowledge the truth, unlike the US. The hostages are continuing to suffer under these conditions, right? And the stated goal of, we want to completely wipe out Hamas. Well, congratulations, Netanyahu. Congratulations, guys. You're now radicalizing an entire, who knows how many people here, whether it's in all different countries because of what you're doing, because of the atrocities that you're committing. And honestly, just one last point. A former Israeli parliament member put this perfectly and possibly the darkest way possible. It's that Hitler wanted this to happen. He wanted to show the world that if the Jewish people had power, that they would become butchers. I don't believe that about Israel or the Israeli people, but I do believe that about Netanyahu and his government. See you guys next week.